Thank you all. First and foremost, I just want to say thank you to all of you for coming. I really appreciate all the feedback I've got over the last few years about this work, and it's work that's really close to my heart, but obviously, as Tanya said, close to many people's hearts who have lived in Hackney over the last few years. So, as Tanya mentioned, I'm Richard Yeboah. I'm a local historian and very much documenting the story of regeneration, gentrification, social change and belonging in the context of the transformation of Hackney over the last 20 or 30 years or so. I'm going to be touching upon, I guess, the general history of Hackney over the last 200 years to paint that picture around regeneration and gentrification, but also talking a little bit about the personal stories that I've captured over the last few years, as well as my own experiences of regeneration and gentrification and how it's impacted my personal life and I think my future as well. So why Hackney? So to cut a long story short, Hackney is my home. It's been my home for the last 32 years. It's where my parents first settled way back in the 1980s when they came from Ghana. It's where I went primary school. It's where I went secondary school. It's where I went college. It's where I had my first Holy Communion. It's where I met my wife, who's also from Hackney. It's where I had my kids in Homerton Hospital. It's where I still live to this day. It's where I learned how to ride a bike. It's where I met almost all of my friends. Hackney is ingrained in my life, my soul, my body, and it very much will form part of, or very much does form part of who I am today. And I'm just going to kind of talk through some of these pictures. That's a picture of my dad, my brother and my sister. My brother's sitting over here. That's them, I think in 1990, literally about 3 minutes away where the car park is, just by McDonald's. That's me getting baptized in 2000 in St. John's the Baptist Church. That's my mum sitting on the stairs where I used to live near Victoria Park. That's me and my brother holding me over there before we go to school. That's me and my daughter standing outside Stamford Hill Estate where I live today. That's my dad way back in the 1980s who used to work as the mini cabs off Wall Street, and that's me on prom night outside Carnival School. I don't know who I thought I was, but yeah, yeah, that was the thing back then. But I think these pictures just demonstrate how much Hackney means to me and how much Hackney has formed a part of my life. But Hackney is not only, I guess, in some respects, important for its impact on me on a personal level, but it's also fundamentally important for the people who have come from Hackney. Hackney is famous for Idris Elba, the Cray Twins, Rudimental, Barbara Windsor, Trevor Nelson. So many important figures in British history and British society today emanate from Hackney and share those same values, that same culture that I grew up with way back in the 1990s and 2000s. But Hackney is also famous for its places like the Hackney Empire, like Rio Cinema, like Ridley Road Market, like Shoreditch, like Clapton, like Hoxton, Stoke Newington, Stamford Hill. All of these places are so important in shaping and developing the fabric of Hackney, that multicultural, working class essence that I think is unrivaled in comparison to any other part in London and maybe potentially in England. But Hackney is also really, really famous for its politics and its political activism. It's always been at the forefront of the fight against fascism, for working class rights, the fight against racism, more recently the fight against Islamophobia. And of course, it's also famous for appointing the first black female MP in Diane Abbott. I think Hackney, just reflecting on all these really important points, is just such a special place, which, as I'm going to talk about in a little bit more detail in the next few slides, in some respects, I feel like it's losing that element of specialness as regeneration and gentrification sweeps across the borough. So I've kind of touched upon this already, but I think we can all agree that the Hackney that I've just spoken about, it feels like it's changing. It feels like it's disappearing. It feels like the Hackney of old no longer exists. And I think some of you may have seen this picture on Twitter, but I think this picture is just a reflection of how much Hackney has changed over the last 20 or so years. The first picture is me with my friends off the corner of Wells Street. It was a time when Hackney was a very different place. As I mentioned before, very working class in nature, poor education, poor levels of housing, high levels of unemployment, a general sense of, I wouldn't say despair, but a general sense of poverty, and high levels of crime, which I guess me, my brother, and many other young people during that time not only encountered, but in some respects were close to individuals that were involved in criminal activity as well. But I think what I would say about the 1990s and the early 2000s and the Hackney of old is that it definitely felt like a community. It definitely felt, amidst all the poverty and all the other kind of negative connotations and attributes that Hackney was receiving, particularly at that time, there was a real sense of community and belonging and a shared culture among the people that lived in Hackney. And, you know, I still talk to my wife about the good old days when we used to, well, not me and my wife, but me and my brother would play knockdown ginger, or we'd throw eggs at people and do other bad stuff. But it was all part of growing up young and being part of that kind of impoverished environment, but still enjoying living through that experience. In 2020, I went back to Wells Street just to have a look around, and as I started to kind of dig deeper into my research into regeneration and gentrification, and I was cycling through South Hackney, where me and my family grew up, well, me and my brothers and sisters grew up in, and the place is completely different. Those communities that existed only 10, 15 years ago have disappeared. It feels quiet. It feels like that culture that once existed has gone. It feels far more middle class. It feels far more white. It feels less inclusive to what it felt like only 20 years ago. And you can see it in the new builds around Wells Street, around South Hackney, around Homerton. You can see it in the shops, kind of former supermarkets, laundrettes, and now trendy cafes, and now places that I don't know if I feel comfortable walking in. I don't know if they feel comfortable with me walking in. And I think that's just a reflection of, you know, just at a snapshot level, how much Hackney has changed. But I think in order to really understand that change, it's really about looking at the overarching history of Hackney over the last 200 years to kind of paint that picture and demonstrate how this has happened. This isn't a process that has only existed for the last 20 or 30 years. This is a process that has emerged through, I would say, probably the last 2 centuries of regeneration of, well, I'll talk in more detail about that in the next few slides. So how and why did Hackney change? So I'm sure many of you would know, but this may come as a surprise to many people. Hackney in the 17th and 18th century was a middle-class suburb. It was a place for the emerging capitalists to be away from the working class, impoverished environments in the East End. It felt like an area that was away from some of those poorer communities in Stepney Green, in Mile End, in Bethnal Green, and Whitechapel. And it was very much a middle class haven. It was very much an environment where people had large villas, people had bowling greens, people were fencing. It was, I don't even know what you would compare it to now, but it was very much not the Hackney that I think a lot of us would be familiar with. And this was, in some respects, I guess a connection to, and this is where there's a connection to the middle class environment where we have now. It's almost as if those middle class communities that once existed 200 years back have all of a sudden come back. And I'm going to talk about that journey through the process of how this middle class community is effectively disappears by the end of the 18th century. And what is the process behind that change and how that influenced Hackney's gradual shift from a middle class, bourgeois, I guess, very, culturally different area to what it is today and what it has been or what it was for the last 100 years. So by the 1800s, there's a gradual process of increased industrialization in the East End, increased manufacturing in the East End, and those communities that initially were in Stepney Green, in Mile End, in Bow, in Bethnal Green and Whitechapel start to encroach further north into Hackney. And as Britain's empire starts to expand across the world, particularly during the Victorian period, and manufacturing starts to spread across the world, Hackney gradually becomes part of that working class, impoverished East End. And what you start to see is a transition from those middle class communities to working class communities. Those middle class villas and villages that existed only 50 years earlier become slum dwellings. And you start to get this process whereby as more people move into Hackney, those impoverished conditions are entrenched. There's increased levels of malnutrition, there's increased levels of general poverty. And as a consequence of the increased level of people living in those areas, there's an increased level of slum dwellings as developers, many of those who were rich as a result of slavery, start to build houses far more cheaply. And you start to see slum dwellings across Homerton, Clapton, South Hackney. And in actual fact, what is really interesting is the population of Hackney went from 50,000 in 1801 to 389,000 in 1901. So that's just a reflection of the kind of influx of people moving into that area in search for work as manufacturing increases. And that gradually has an impact on class structures in Hackney over time. And by 1901, Hackney is probably one of the poorest areas of London, when only 100 years earlier it was, as I said before, a middle class suburb. Hackney's plight at the start of the 20th century would only get worse as a consequence of the First World War, but more devastatingly as a consequence of the Second World War, mainly due to the Blitz, where I believe 2,000 people died in Hackney alone. But not just in terms of the death toll, there was a huge demoralising impact of the war, not only in Hackney, but of course across London and across Britain overall. And this just further entrenched the working class impoverished conditions that had emerged during the Victorian period. And by the early 1940s, people living in Hackney have gone through 20, 30, 40 years of poverty. Of course, as you know, after the Second World War and the emergence of the welfare state, there was a huge emphasis to rid the country of its working class slums that had emerged over the last 50, 60, 70 years. And that was principally driven by the Abercrombie plan, which is very much about developing new forms of housing for the communities that had been impacted by the war, and also kind of the overarching developments of the welfare state that really drove forward universal healthcare, education, etc., etc. The initial period of the late 1940s and early 1950s was really about building sufficient housing for those communities. And one example is the Guinness Trust Estate, which I believe was built sometime in the late 1940s. I actually still live there with my wife. And this is about providing housing that was fit for heroes. I've spoken to so many people as part of my book who grew up during that time and were kids after the Second World War. And they talk about how bad the housing was before and after the Second World War. They talk about when they lived in slum dwellings in the 1930s and 1940s, they would share a room with 6 or 7 other people. There would be an outside toilet. There wouldn't be proper sanitary facilities. These estates were transformational for some of these communities. For the first time, individuals had their own rooms, they had their own toilets, they had play areas outside their estates. In some estates you had shops, you had other amenities, you had a real sense of trying to rebuild communities after the Second World War. And I think in some respects in the first half of the post-war period, you could argue that that process, that rebuilding program was successful. There was a large swathe of new estates that were built across Hackney: Guinness Trust Estate, Stamford Hill Estate, Springfield Estate, Frampton Park Estate, Nesbitt Estate. So many estates were built just in that initial period that provided housing to people who, prior to that period, had never had proper homes. I think the real problem emerged in the early 1960s, where that demand for housing became increasingly pressurizing for central government, but also Hackney Council and the GLC as well. And I think what started to emerge is, in order to meet that demand of increased housing for those communities that had suffered so much during the Second World War, they started to build housing that was using cheaper materials and building higher. And I think there's a number of examples of this with the Trowbridge Estate, which I'm going to talk about in a bit more detail, Clapton Park Estate, Holly Street Estate, which used to be about 5 minutes away, Kingshold Estate. And these estates were very different from the low-level estates that were built in the late 1940s. They were very much about, or they felt like, particularly to some of the people that I've spoken to in my book, they felt like they were just being rushed. And I'm going to talk about a specific estate that is going to kind of demonstrate how poor some of that housing was in the early 1960s. So some of you may know this estate. This is the Carpenter Estate. This is Ronan Point. In 1968, there was an explosion in a woman's house. I believe it was 2 days after the estate was officially opened. That explosion was just a gas explosion. I believe the woman I think she was cooking food. I'm not sure. Maybe she was, or maybe she wasn't. But that had an impact on the overarching estate. 4 floors of the estate were blown off immediately. And I believe it resulted in the death of, I think it was 4 people, and it injured 17. But I guess alongside the death toll, what was really significant about this was it demonstrated how poor some of the housing was being, the poor condition of some of the housing that was being built during the late 1960s. Despite that, as I mentioned before, Hackney still go on to build some really, on my reflection, really poor level of housing. Trowbridge Estate, Kingswold Estate, Holly Street Estate is built in a very similar way to some of these estates, and this would lead to some of the degradation and increased poverty that exists in Hackney by the 1980s and 1990s. A really important quote that Paul Harrison mentioned in his book was that the post-war period was supposed to be about ridding Hackney and so many working class communities of slum dwellings. And in some respects, the regeneration program just reinforced that 20, 30 years later. I think what makes the condition of the estates in the 1960s far more worse by the 1970s is quite a significant decline in the British economy. So I guess there's a number of reasons for the decline in the British economy. Obviously, Britain's imperial power after the Second World War starts to decline as countries across the world call for independence, but also Britain itself can't maintain its previously vast empire after the Second World War. Of course, it has to pay back some of its debts from the Second World War, but also there's a number of effects, global effects in terms of other economies across the world competing with Britain. And that has a huge effect on Britain's domestic manufacturing and domestic economy. As I mentioned before, Hackney in the Victorian period had a large number of a significant manufacturing economy and significant industrialization. There's a significant wave of deindustrialization as that economic impact, or that global economic impact, really hits hard on Britain, and particularly on Hackney. And that's just exacerbated by the oil crisis in the late 1970s, as well as the market crash in the 1970s as well. And what you start to see is degradation. That's Ridley Road Market, just around the corner, with rubbish not being picked up. That's Stoke Newton Common towards the end of the 1970s, and that's an estate and where you start to see by the 1970s some of those estates that were so poorly built become slums in themselves, as unemployment rises, as people have less money, as there's a general decline in the welfare of Britain's communities. Alongside that, there's significant strike action in response to the closures of industry, and that has an impact on services being provided by local authorities. And I think it was probably most pertinent, and just based on some of the conversations I've had with many people about my book, during the winter of discontent, during the harshest winter, I believe it was in the late 1970s, where people vitally needed public services, it just wasn't provided, and people were going cold in their homes that had already been poorly built, and there was just a general sense of impoverishment, particularly in Hackney by the late 1970s. So we all know who that is. I said to my wife, I'm going to try not to bring any of my own political affiliation. Okay, obviously this is Margaret Thatcher. We all know that she was very much against the post-war consensus, or very much the state playing a role in providing public services, the state being the carrier of communities. She was all about rolling back the state, all about encouraging privatization, all about deregulation, all about decentralization. And this was all part of her overarching ideology, influenced by neoliberalism, which would later emerge through Ronald Reagan in America as well. In some respects, Thatcher was implementing these policies in response to the poor economic situation in Britain at the time. But the legacy of her policies would have such a damaging impact on Hackney and other working class communities, it's been 40 years now, to this day. And it's really about, I guess, some of her privatisation policies, particularly around housing. Margaret Thatcher wasn't a fan of government intervention. And one of the most significant policies, in some respects, that kind of had a significant impact in regeneration and later gentrification, was the right to buy policy, giving individuals who lived in council homes the opportunity to buy their homes at a significantly discounted rate. Of course, the ideology in Britain has, particularly since the 1980s, has been to drive forward home ownership. And I believe by the end of the late 1990s, 1 million people had bought their homes through the right to buy process. But what this did is that it stripped away council housing from those who needed it most. And it continues to do that to this day. Right to buy had a huge influence in terms of how councils distributed their housing. So what began to materialize by the late 1980s is that individuals on the best estates or the best housing would buy those homes. Individuals would want to be transferred to better estates to buy their homes, which left the poorest communities on the worst of estates. And for example, Holly Street, which had the 4 tower blocks and the streets in the sky, you had individuals in that estate where I believe it was 50% of individuals in Holly Street were unemployed. You had a large number of migrants being placed in that estate. But that was also influenced by the council's own housing policy, which was, of course, impacted by right to buy, but also as a result of the council's own negligence and malpractice. The council itself was known for placing black and ethnic minority individuals in some of the worst estates. And there was actually a report in 1984 which spoke about how the council were responsible or were targeting ethnic minority individuals by giving them less proper housing in those areas. And that kind of fueled, in some respects, or particularly in hindsight, fueled Thatcher's point that councils and government, or the state, just wasn't effective enough in managing public services. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about the council's, at that time, Hackney Council's negligence in terms of managing those estates. But Thatcher's policies weren't just focused around right to buy. There was the Rates Act, which had an impact on local government funding, and there was a general stripping back of local government funding during the 1980s, where councils were having to close down key services in their building programs, in their maintenance programs, and that meant that some of those estates that had been built so poorly, when by the 1980s there began to emerge issues around windows, lifts, and general poverty in those estates, the council wasn't able to respond to those issues. But there's also another fundamental policy that has had or will have an impact on regeneration and gentrification, is the shift or the transfer of council homes to housing associations, which meant that individuals who could buy their homes through the right to buy policy could no longer do so, but they also no longer had the same tenancy rights that they did under housing association tenancies. And this policy of what I would consider a general neoliberal attempt to privatise and deregulate council ownership of housing has subsequently had an effect on the council's ability to build homes over the last 30 years, but has also stripped away key housing that would have been needed for the communities, including myself, who live and have worked in Hackney over the last 20, 30 years. Just the last point on Thatcher and the kind of battle between the Conservatives and Hackney Council. Hackney Council was seen as, I guess, one of the loony left local authorities. She didn't trust Hackney Council along with a number of inner London councils. She didn't trust the GLC, and obviously the GLC was eventually abolished in the late 1980s, which further shifted GLC responsibilities to local authorities who were already cash-strapped. So this was just a general attempt by Thatcher to absolutely destroy the mechanisms of local government to actually provide services to local people. And this is just a reflection in the 1980s of the initial impact of some of Thatcher's policies. There begins to be a rise in racism and a general just distrust between working class communities and the policies of Thatcher. One really interesting example is the events in Sandringham Road and the front line, where there was a large black community that felt targeted by police authorities, and I guess there was a general sense that Thatcher's policies were targeting minority groups and black communities, and that was kind of demonstrated in the police relationship between the relationship between the police and the front line and communities in Hackney more generally. And one example was the death of Colin Roach. But you also start to see a rise in squatting and general dilapidation in several estates across Hackney. But again, this also results in, as I mentioned at the start of this presentation, a rise in political activism. Communities across Hackney came together, joined together through that shared understanding that those policies by Thatcher were wrong, and fought against those policies. And I guess the clearest example is the fight against the poll tax, which eventually led to the demise of Thatcher. But Hackney was very much at the forefront of working class activism against the policies of central government. So by the time Thatcher leaves in the early 1990s, Hackney is probably in the worst condition it has been in comparison to the last 100, 200 years. And I'm just going to read out some of these facts because they're really important in terms of the context that me, my brother, and my wife grew up in those early 1990s. So Hackney, as you know, became one of was the poorest borough in London and the third poorest in the whole country. I think that really exemplifies how significant that poverty had been entrenched as a result of Thatcher's policies, but also the policies of the mismanagement of Hackney Council. But unemployment had also rose to over 25%, and average incomes was only approximately 12 grand, which is far less than the inner London average. So not only were Hackney having to suffer through quite poor housing and policies that were targeting, or what was felt to be targeting, working class communities, communities had no money. So they were having to live through impoverished conditions, but had no solution to kind of get through those situations. A really important fact around housing: it would take 153 million just to get, at that time, just to get Hackney's housing stock to an acceptable standard. So I was reading this fact to my wife yesterday, and I had to take a step back again. What does that mean for the standard of Hackney's housing at that period? And I can just remember briefly, and I'll actually talk about that in the next slide, but just how bad Hackney's housing was in the late 1990s and even in the early 2000s. As you know, as you may not know, Hackney was the borough for some of the worst performing schools in the country, including Hackney Downs, which was closed in 1995, which had, I think it was something like 80% of individuals who spoke English as their second language, and had GCSE results that were in the low 10, 15%. Kingsland School, which was eventually closed in 2000, and Homerton Boys, which was closed in 2004. You had education being connected to the impoverished conditions And individuals were not only alongside housing, not able to get sufficient education. So across the board, education, housing, employment was being destroyed as a result of those policies of Thatcher. And just the last 2 points, Hackney was rife with crime and gang activity. I remember it, my brother remembers it. Murder Mile in Lower Clapton, where I believe between 2000 and 2002, there was about 9 or 10 murders. This was being widely reported in the news that Hackney was almost this no-go zone. It wasn't safe to live in. And if I'm honest, I remember living in Hackney during that period, and I never felt safe going to another estate or another part of Hackney. And this was kind of the precursor to the post-Code Wars, where, you know, that general sense of poverty around housing, around education, then influenced and had an impact on crime. And as mentioned before, that the relationship between communities and the police had already been broken down by the somewhat racist relationship of the police at that time, which was, I guess, most demonstrated in the Broadwater riots, but was also existing in Hackney at that time as well. And Hackney Council actually was bankrupt in 2000. Obviously, councils can't go bankrupt, but it needed central government intervention in 2000, mainly because of its mismanagement and financial malaise. And during this period, as a result of the policies of Thatcher and privatisation and deregulation, obviously that had an impact on the council's ability to fund services. But I've spoken to many individuals who worked in the council during that period, and there was just general mismanagement, general misuse of funds. I speak to individuals about, and really, I'm not going to name who that individual is actually, but I spoke to someone about this a couple of years ago, and they worked for Hackney Housing during the period, and they spoke about how when their teams used to get called out to do fixes on the estates, they just wouldn't turn up. They would go to the pub or they would go somewhere else. So people were getting paid to do services that they just didn't undertake. And many of the residents that lived in those estates during that period used to talk about how bad Hackney Council was. And I remember being young, everyone talked about how bad Hackney Council was. And by the 1980s and 1990s, Hackney's estates fall into complete disrepair. The 5 estates that are here, Trowbridge Estate, Kingshold Estate, Holly Street Estate, Clapton Park Estate, and Nightingale Estate, become some of the worst housing across London, but across the country. And obviously, many of you probably won't recognise these estates because they don't exist anymore, and I'm going to be talking about that in a little bit more detail. But I don't think people understand, and I've got some very distant memories of Kingshold Estate, but I don't think people understand how bad the housing was at that period. 80% of people that lived in Holly Street Estate at that time wanted to transfer to another estate. People were getting burgled regularly. Houses were being destroyed, burnt out. There was squatting, there was crime. And in some respects, this was reflective of how some of those estates were designed, as I mentioned way back in the 1960s, where you had tower blocks that had 20 floors and had dark spots where criminals could avoid arrest. You had streets in the sky, which allowed criminals and robberies to take place. As I mentioned before, the Hackney Council weren't really undertaking repairs, so broken out windows and broken doors and lifts were broken consistently. In actual fact, there was one incident in, I think it was 1993, where an individual actually died in a lift on the Kingshold Estate because it was broken, and I think it dropped from the 11th floor to the first floor in a couple of seconds. This is the conditions that Hackney was in during this period. And I remember being, I think when I started primary school in the early 1990s, and I remember walking through the Kingshold Estate, and I remember always being nervous about going through the underneath tunnels to get to my primary school. And I just remember the rubbish on the floor and the boarded up doors and just the general sense that this isn't a place that I'd want to live in. But I've spoken to so many people that lived in those estates, and they talk about it like it was hell on earth. I lived just probably about 5 minutes away from the King's Old Estate. I lived in a maisonette. I was lucky enough to live just off one of those estates. But as you'll see, the experiences of those people that have lived in those estates has fundamentally shaped them. One thing I will say, though, about these estates is that they also, as I mentioned at the start of this presentation, they built a sense of community amidst that poverty. So even though there was broken lifts, broken doors, broken windows, in actual fact, some people loved living in those estates because they loved living amongst working class, multicultural communities that were all sharing the same experience of unemployment, of poor education, of poor housing, of the threat of crime, of having parents who spoke English as a second language. There was that real sense of community. And that even existed when I was growing up in the early 2000s as well. You obviously know who these two individuals are as well. This I think there was a real watershed moment when John Major comes into power in the early 1990s, and then eventually Tony Blair and the Labour government in 97. You see a continuation of the neoliberal policies of Thatcher and a continuation of deregulation, right to buy, decentralization, privatization. I've got to wrap through these next few slides, so I'm going to do that pretty quickly. Right, so as you through these two governments, there's a real incentive to try and engage with the public sector and try and engage with councils far more differently. And what was really significant was they started to engage with local authorities like Hackney Council on the premise that we will provide funding to your council if you abide by these decentralization, these privatization policies. And the biggest example was the Comprehensive Estate Initiative, which was a £500 million programme to regenerate Hackney's estates. Those 5 estates that I mentioned before, this is them now. This is them completely regenerated. Kingshold Estate, Holly Street Estate, Clacton Park Estate, Nightingale Estate, Trowbridge Estate. The tile blocks disappeared. Some of the streets in the sky disappeared. You had low levels of low-level housing being built. You had, for the first time, individuals being able to see their streets outside, people having gardens, etc., etc. This was a huge regeneration program to kind of remove the impoverished conditions in Hackney. But what was significant about this regeneration program in response to the point around and the eventual emergence of gentrification was that the regeneration program meant that several people that lived in the previous estates had to move elsewhere. In some cases temporarily, in some cases forever. So those estates that had that real working class community lost it in the space of 10 years. Not only that, the houses that were built on the estates were often less than the houses that were originally built in the 1960s. So there was always going to be a proportion of individuals, 10, 20%, that literally could not come back post-regeneration. But I think most importantly was how the program was designed. So before that point, obviously, as I mentioned before, the programs in the 1960s were all about community, were all about providing council housing. As part of these regeneration programs, there was a partition of housing. So you had council housing, but a lot of the homes on these estates were given to housing associations and, more importantly, to the private sector. So they were sold off. And what begins to emerge is, of course, individuals who can buy a home, individuals who have bought a home through right to buy it and subsequently could sell it back to sell it on the private market, influence that shift in those communities where those working class communities gradually left those estates and more wealthier, middle class, often white communities emerged in these areas. And this completely shifted how those estates, the outlook of some of those estates. So really quickly, I'm just going to talk about how gentrification kind of was reinforced by the impact of certain things in the early 2000s, or 2000s more generally. The 2012 Olympics, obviously, of course, this was a huge regeneration program in Stratford, in Newham. This led to mass investment in the East End overall, but this more importantly made Hackney more attractive overnight. I think before the Olympics, no one wanted to live in Hackney. And all of a sudden, I remember when I was 18, 19, I just remember Dorset completely changing after the Olympics. The shops looked different, the nightclubs disappeared, the cafes emerged, and the people were different, obviously. And as that part of that process of Olympics, people started to buy homes in the Olympics. And obviously where we're standing right now, the CLR James Library, which didn't exist prior to the Olympics, was all part of that regeneration program to make Hackney far more attractive. And this led to the influence of house prices being driven up through demand as a result of that regeneration. 2011 riots, which obviously had a big impact on Hackney and the perception of working class communities in Hackney. And there was a real incentive to demonize working class communities in Hackney. Obviously the riots in Hackney was quite bad. I had a few friends who had been involved in the riots and subsequently went to prison as well. But it felt like during that period a real targeted effort to demonize working class communities and kind of shift the emphasis of Hackney from being that working class ethnic minority environment and seeing the riots as kind of an isolated criminal incident, when it was very much about I think a response to the impoverished conditions that had existed in Hackney that a lot of young, particularly black men, had grown up in over the last 10, 20 years. And of course, underpinning all of that was austerity. Austerity was just an extension or continuation of neoliberalism, but far more destructive. Obviously, after the impact of the subprime crisis in the late 2008, 2009, the government was incentivized to cut services significantly. Youth clubs, the police, education, council services, central government services, housing. All of these services were drastically cut, which had an impact on working class communities to live and thrive in places like Hackney. And I remember growing up in this time, I was about 18, 19, 20, and just feeling like there was almost no hope. The government are targeting us individuals, and I can't see myself living in Hackney for much longer. And most of my friends would probably agree with me as well. Just before actually I move on, a really important point about the policies of that age was obviously Help to Buy, which obviously gave individuals an equity loan to purchase housing. Sorry, my battery's died, so I'm going to try and talk as much as I can. But Help to Buy had an impact on the housing market more generally. But I'm just going to talk overall about, and probably come to a close. I've probably only got 2 minutes. Gentrification is a result of that whole journey of the regeneration of Hackney being stimulated by government policy to, I think, forcibly remove working class communities from Hackney and make Hackney far more attractive to middle class communities. And that has happened. And now the working class communities like myself, my wife, my brother, we can't afford to buy homes in this area. If I'm looking to buy a home, I'm having to move probably about 20 miles away. But I don't want to do that. And I think we have to always reflect on not only the financial inability for individuals to purchase a home, but the real cultural impact that gentrification and regeneration has had on our communities, on myself, who no longer feel at home in a borough that we've lived in for all of our lives. I don't know anywhere different. So I think it's just something that I'm going to be reflecting on in my book. Hopefully my book's out next year. You can follow me on, I think I'll share my Twitter and my website afterwards. But thank you so much for attending. I wanted to talk about a bit more detail, but I think my time's running out, so apologies. Thank you.
Time for questions. So if people have got a question, one here.
Richard, sorry, good afternoon. Thank you.
Afternoon.
In your opinion, I mean, on balance, what do you think regeneration, gentrification, the impact on the borough, is it positive or negative in general?
Yeah, I get asked this question every day, I think. So, yeah, I'll repeat the question because yeah. So the question was around is the impact of regeneration, gentrification positive or negative? So I can certainly say there are some positives. As I mentioned before, the housing in Hackney during the 1990s and prior to that period, and even in the early 2000s, was in a really poor condition. It had to be replaced. But I think it's the nature of the regeneration programs and the built-in incentive to privatise large chunks of those estates, which meant that those people that lived in those estates, as I mentioned, could no longer come back to those estates. And that has subsequently had an impact on house prices, because those areas are far more attractive, and then obviously the impact of the Olympics. People who lived in those estates, unless they have the right to buy, and are lucky enough to have the right to buy, you are not purchasing a home in this borough. It's as simple as that. But on the flip side, on the positives, as I said before, like there was certain parts of Hackney I could never walk through when I was 17, 18. I remember walking through Southwold Estate to meet someone. And I remember going there and getting my chain ripped off. I remember going to London Fields when I was 14 on my bike with some of my friends. And obviously I was from South Hackney, E9. London Fields was E8. We was riding our bike. We went through there. I'm not going to talk in any more detail about that, but it was a dangerous situation. Obviously kids are still going through that today, but I think regeneration has enabled places to feel a lot more safer than they were before. But I just think that regeneration needs to focus more on local communities, and a lot of housing associations and councils are trying to drive forward those programs now. I think there's now a general realisation that the privatisation of housing has had quite a damaging effect.
I just wanted to make a point about home ownership.
Yeah.
So I've lived in Hackney all my life, and actually many of us could never afford a house, whatever the market conditions currently are. If you've never had social housing and never had the option of a right to buy, many people have been excluded for a long time. I do realise it's worse, but it's the reality. I live in private rented too.
Yeah.
So it's been a reality for a long time.
Yeah, it's a really valid point, and the point that was mentioned around, you know, the access to purchasing your home and home ownership. I think that because if you look at other European countries, there isn't this incentive to own your own home. I think, particularly after Thatcher, there's been this British consensus that you must own your own home, and I think that's been driven into the British psyche. I think the challenge that we have now is that you not only don't have the ability to purchase your own home, rents are incredibly high, and then there's no social housing. So what do you do? And I think that's the conundrum that the Labour government's going to have to solve when they do get into power, hopefully later this year. Sorry, I didn't mean to say. But the idea is that there has to be a drive to build more affordable housing, more social housing, and don't introduce policies like Help to Buy, which effectively gave individuals the ability to just take out large loans, I think relatively insecure loans with high interest rates after 5 years. But one of the really important points, just before the next question, is I used to work for Homes England, and there was a real incentive about the 300,000 target to build more homes. And over the last 2 years, that target's kind of felt like it's disappeared. Like the target is almost advisory now. Fundamentally, in order to address the issue around demand, you have to provide more supply. There has to be more homes in the market that are available at an affordable price. So hopefully with a change in government, there could be a change in policy around that.
We have time for a few questions, but if you could keep them really brief. There's one here.
So I was born and brought up in Hackney, similar generation to you.
Yeah.
And I feel like now we're living separate but equal lives, the new community and the older community.
Yeah.
And obviously when I say equal, it's disequal on one side and equal on the other.
Yeah.
Do you think that those communities can come together and form a new community in Hackney, or do you think that we'll be traversing life like this they'll criticise each other?
That's an interesting question. The question was about the kind of separation between the new communities in Hackney and the old communities in Hackney, and whether they can kind of amalgamate. I'm not sure, if I'm honest. I'm not sure, because I don't feel it. Like, I don't feel a sense of, like, I appreciate the new communities. I appreciate, you know, I haven't been to, like, me and my wife walk down Stoke Newton every day, and she's like, "You're gonna go Pret?" And I'm like, "No." And like there's always going to be that distinction between those communities and newer communities. But I think this is why it's so important for us to talk about the history and talk about the legacies and talk about, you know, the music, the culture, and don't lose that, because this is, as I said, as I didn't mention, this is not just a phenomenon in Hackney, but it's happened in Tottenham, in Peckham, in New Cross, in New York, in Berlin, you know, Paris to some extent. Like, gentrification it feels inevitable. So what is really important for us is not necessarily assimilate, but we have to kind of reinforce our own cultures so that there's a more of appreciation, I feel, for our culture from those newer communities, which I don't feel is enough at this moment in time.
Can I take you back to education? Because I think one of the positives, I mean, you focus a lot on housing, and I really understand that, but the change in the education system is massive.
100%.
And that must have impacted all communities in Hackney, not just some.
Yeah. To be honest, education is one of the bright spots as part of that, like, I must admit.
Look at you.
I mean, I went Carlton Pole. When my brother went, it was probably worse. But like, that was probably the best school at the time. But we missed out on the academies. So I know when I work and talk to young people, I know those kids that have gone Mosbourne, that have gone City, like, they have a totally different educational experience than what we had in the early 2000s. And I think that is a huge benefit. But again, on the flip side, just on the point of gentrification, people would be more encouraged to move to this area if they've got schools like that. You know, people have come to Hackney because Mosbourne was Tony Blair's school. That was his huge demonstration of how he can improve education in local working class areas. So people were attracted to Hackney because of that educational story. Yes, people from the borough that have lived here benefit from it, but again, it has an impact on gentrification. It has an impact on the communities that can actually afford to live here. So I would certainly say education is a bright story in this context, but it has had an impact as well.
Playing slightly devil's advocate, but you seem to say that gentrification is just due to regeneration. But it's very clear. I mean, you said that things that Hackney wasn't regenerated or gentrified until the Olympic Games. But there's very clear evidence of gentrification going right the way back to the 80s and 90s.
100%.
So there's lots of market mechanisms.
Yeah.
You could say, well, in one sense, what's happened is that the middle classes have simply expanded in numbers. As they expanded, they simply moved into different areas. So people who couldn't afford to live in Islington would move into Stoke Newington. So to some extent, this sort of spillover.
It's a wonderful point. It's something I didn't pick up on. Yeah. It's in the book, though. It was just a point about, I linked gentrification specifically to the Comprehensive Estate Initiative in the late 1990s, 2000s, but gentrification actually happened before that. People were moving to Dorset in the 80s, particularly like the arts communities. And on that point, it kind of links back to gentrification happening probably before that point, where, like was mentioned, communities that couldn't afford to no longer live in Islington or other parts of London were coming to Hackney in the 1980s. So that process of gentrification has actually been going on far more longer, but it definitely intensified when Hackney became attractive overall, because I think Dorset was always somewhat attractive, but I'd certainly say Wells Street was not. Like, Wells Street, Homerton was definitely, like, you did not want to live there. London Fields, like, when I see London Fields, I'm like, oh my days. Like, you're sitting in the park in London Fields and you could not have done this 20 years ago. So, yeah, I think you're right. The gentrification story happened well before. Cool. Any more questions?
Yeah, just real quick, I just have something to add to what you said, and then a question that kind of links up with one before. I was reading a book a couple of years ago, and I thankfully took a picture of this one piece, but it says, in London, life expectancy drops reliably by 1 year for every 2 stops traveled eastwards from Westminster on the district line of the Underground. So it really just links up with what you were saying about the different communities. But the question I have, which kind of links up with a question earlier, is I think the gentrification part of it, at least that we're seeing here, is of course from predominantly white middle class youth or young adults who are perhaps the first downwardly mobile and are essentially waiting for their parents to die in order to inherit any form of wealth. And really my question is rooted in what is to be done. Is there any way that you think this influx of downwardly mobile folks could find community with people here, and perhaps what could they do together? Basically, what is to be done? But just would value any thoughts you have on that.
I think it's a really difficult one. I think the question was about what could be done to solve the issue around gentrification, and I'm not sure, because councils are cash strapped and they're struggling to build housing by themselves. So a good example is the Woodbury Down regeneration, where the council have worked with Berkeley and Notting Hill Genesis to redevelop the area. Obviously the council want to return on investment, but they also want to protect the communities in those areas. But it's almost impossible to do, because as I mentioned before, usually in regeneration programs, the amount of housing that was initially on the original estate is reduced to through that regeneration process, and some of those individuals that are on those estates disappeared. And I live quite close to Woodbury Down, so I don't know, when councils are suffering financially and don't have the ability to build housing effectively, I think there's always going to be a struggle with councils having to work with the private sector, who are fundamentally going to be thinking about return of investment, and not necessarily about the communities. Some of those houses in Woodbury Down are like going for £1 million. So like, there's no way that someone that's lived in Hackney can afford that. So I don't know. I probably need to do more reading on that, to be fair.
Just to add to that point, I wonder if thinking outside of housing for social connection, you mentioned there are loads of spaces that you can go into in Hackney. I feel the same. I moved away, London Field to be there. I bought my first flat in 2009.
I wish I was you.
Yeah. I've done well.
Yeah.
But I wonder if it's not just about housing actually, and the council supporting initiatives where new and old communities can come together outside of that for social connection, to get to know each other. This celebration of culture that you spoke about, it's really difficult to ever see a way to really show that to the new people who are coming in. And I hear what you're saying about the downwardly mobile, but actually what I found is a lot of, I'm older than you, but a lot of the older people that have moved in are very wealthy, and it's a very different background too, and I don't know how we merge them, because they almost feel like they're in and out, they're here for the housing.
and the culture, because a lot of people come to Hackney. I remember in 2012 when the Olympics first, it was kind of the Olympic buzz, and I remember like how Shoreditch and Dalston became so attractive in terms of like the nightlife and just like coming to Dalston, and I think there's a part of me that, I don't want to be specific about gentrifiers, because gentrifiers can come in all different forms, but they've come and they've experienced the culture and they love it, but you're stripping it back by not allowing us to kind of, one, being able to live here, and two, kind of have that cultural experience. And a good example is, like with the nightlife being kind of, I think there's a ban on nightlife past a certain time in Dalston, and that has an impact on, cultures who would have partied until 4 or 5 a.m. like in the Four Races Club, and had that real connection with their fellow communities. I don't know, maybe the council could do more. I think the council could do more I think things like Hackney Carnival or Hackney Half Marathon are like good opportunities for mixed communities to come to those events. But at the same time, I get the sense that those events are starting to feel a lot less inclusive of like our communities. And in some respects, some people might feel like, why do I need to do that? I've got that already in my estate, but that's disappearing. So it's a tricky one.
Can I just
I've only spoken to a few, if I'm honest.
I'm kind of surrounded by them, and there's a lot of, I think, overseas people who work in finance.
Yeah.
I hear a lot of, mostly white people, but I hear a lot of accents.
Mm.
But also in terms of kind of community straddling, I'm in Yeboah and we do quite a bit of community stuff there. And people do, there is a kind of joining there in terms of who does some volunteering at different things. So there is some stuff happening. But I'm as curious as everyone about where they all come from. Because they're sort of 20-something, and where were they born?
Yeah.
I don't know.
And they got wealth, that's the thing.
Because they're landlords, quite often it's hedge fund managers, their portfolio thing. If there's statistics about who is buying up council properties, and then
Precisely.
they buy multiple.
But where are the young, you know all these 20-somethings who drink lots of coffee? I mean, where were they born?
I don't know them. Like, I don't know them. I'm not gonna be honest.
Private resident accommodation, you can spend your spontaneous money on having a coffee because you're giving the rest of it to your land.
Yeah, I just want to get
We've probably got time for one more question. I think this is this lady over there.
Yeah, could I just say, sorry, I'm over here. Could I just say, I think there's a ripple effect. I don't think the working class is being driven just at Hackney. I think it's certainly in North East London. I live in South Woodford, which is like miles away.
Yeah.
And it's the absolute limit of the East London postcode.
Yeah.
And we're being gentrified. So like the working class are going out to places like Harlow.
Yeah.
They're being driven right out into Essex.
Yeah, and it does have a ripple effect because those communities would kind of see us as, the question was about, is there a ripple effect with gentrification? Because obviously communities in the East End are getting driven further east and even further east. It's interesting because, when me and my wife are thinking about, buying a home, like I'm always thinking about, if I move to like, say Milton Keynes and I've got wealth and I go there and someone's going to say to me, well, but you're from London, so like you're better than me. And that's how I feel about gentrifiers. So it does have a ripple effect. I think, again, there has to be a government incentive to really help, I think, people who live in those communities to get some form of affordable housing, and I don't know if first dibs is the word, but get the opportunity to purchase their homes in their own areas. But also a more overarching Britain-wide policy around investing in areas, which they've tried to do through levelling up, but it hasn't really worked. So
thank you, Richard, for that fascinating talk.